It seemed somehow appropriate, post Dudley and Eunice, that we're talking about storms today, particularly after Eunice in this area. I think, fortunately, mostly around here, apart from a few fence panels and pots over and branches down, and trees down, we haven't had too much disruption. A friend of mine, actually, I saw she's been off power for 24 hours at the moment. Given that she has an essay to get in next week, she's not very happy. So we've come through that storm. But I think, I don't know about you, I mean, that wind was pretty scary, wasn't it? I mean, we put our head outside the door at one point, and I thought, no, I'm staying inside. And I think, actually, that very, very present reminder of the sheer power of a storm is a really good thing to hang on to when we look at this story. The sheer force of that wind was scary. So here we are on the shores of Lake Galilee. And what's been happening is that Jesus has been teaching. And it's been a pretty intense time of teaching. And the disciples have been with him. Now, if you look at where that happens in Luke's Gospel, I think at the time we've had Jesus calling the disciples to follow him and then them walking with him primarily in the context of teaching. Now, of course, that's what a rabbi did. A rabbi was a teacher. He drew a group of acolytes around him, and that group of acolytes would learn more and be able to understand more through the teaching of the rabbi. And I would hazard a guess that really that's who Jesus was to them at that stage, a rabbi and a friend. Someone they really trusted, but probably not a lot more than that. But then they get to the lake, and Jesus asks them to cast off. And actually, in that casting off, their faith and their understanding of who Jesus is going to grow enormously. I'm sure everything seemed normal when they were going to cast off. They were fishermen, it was what they did, it was their lake, they knew how to handle themselves. Jesus would have been exhausted, no doubt, through all that teaching, so hardly surprising that he went to sleep. They felt comfortable about that because they knew where they were going, they knew what they were doing. But of course, life doesn't always stay simple and within the boundaries of what we know. Because this wasn't an ordinary storm, any more than Eunice was an ordinary storm. And what happened was that these confident young fishermen who knew what they were doing came to a point where they thought, oh my goodness, we are perishing. I mean, they must have wondered how on earth Jesus could sleep through it, frankly. And it's like, what are you doing? Why aren't you waking up? But of course, they had to do something. They actually had to ask him. They had to wake him up. And eventually they do that. And he's woken up, and he acts, and how he acts, suddenly it is calm. And as they drew breath, I think it probably hit them like that wind, like a thunderbolt. Who is this? He calmed a storm. Now they were on a lake over the waters, and the waters in the sort of theology of the time and the theology of the Old Testament are a scary place. And actually, we heard the story of creation read to us. In the other story of creation, there's very specifically a separating of the waters from the land. And the waters were a place of evil and of scary monsters. I mean, in creation myths in in many ancient Near Eastern religions, there were sea monsters that God has had to somehow wrestle with to bring into being the world. Can you imagine what the fear of drowning must have been if you were over the deep where the evil things were? That's the level of fear they have. That's the level of fear of annihilation. And the only person who had power out of the waters, who separated out of the waters, who created man, who created woman, was God. Who was this? Now, I think sometimes we make our God, our Jesus, too small. We think of him as a friend and rabbi, we walk with him. And that's good and that's right, because that is part of who he is. But he is also God. And actually what we have to do is to cast off, to find that, cast off from the sacred land. Do what he says in our lives, communally and individually, to cast off, to learn the truth of who Jesus is and the awesome power of who this is that we can trust. I mean, obviously, that picture of the storm is one of, in a sense, easy resonance. We've all recognised it as a picture of the storms we all suffer through life, and that we can suffer both individually and communally. In some ways, I think, because it's so familiar, it can become a bit trite. But actually, it's not trite at all. And I think it's really important, each time we read a piece of familiar Bible like that, we say, so what is God saying for us today? It's been a picture that has been used throughout church history, and from the very earliest church fathers. That picture of the storm and of Jesus rescuing us has been one that has been used both individually and also communally for us as a church. And I think communally, as a broad church in the Church of England and indeed the Christian church in this country, we probably do feel a bit tossed. I don't know if any of you listened to the Sunday programme, but there was a little piece on it about a church in North Yorkshire where the minister had turned up and he tweeted on Twitter a picture. No one had turned up. One person turned up, and she didn't feel comfortable about taking communion on her own, and so he left. He went to his other church, which is thriving as it happens. But I think that post-pandemic example of a congregation that was previously 10 or 12 that had dwindled to 1 or none is part of that picture of a church that feels battered and feels battered. But the great thing about this story is that it reminds us that whether it's individually or in the little ship of the church, we've been there before, and Jesus has been there before. And he's seen the church through Roman persecutions, through the collapse of society in the end of the Roman Empire. He's seen the church through the Black Death. He's seen it through normal famine and flood. He has always been there. And there has been a moment when he's been able to bring the church safe to shore, that it can grow again. And what about us individually? There were sort of three things that really struck me. One was that casting off. If we are going to learn the true power of the Lord and to allow him to show that power and to act in the way that I've just given an example of, to bring us through safe to shore, we have to be prepared to cast off from the safety of the land. If those disciples hadn't cast off, they wouldn't have seen that amazing action of Jesus that made them so amazed that it was, oh my goodness, who is this? We need to cast off sometimes. thing about when we've cast off, that, we've done it in all confidence. We know where we're going, we know what we're doing. We're just like those fishermen. We're in a space that we feel, yes, we've heard what the Lord's told us to do, we know what we're going to do. And then where is he? He seems to be sleeping. He's just not there. Of course he is there, and at the right moment, and when we call upon him, he can act, and he does act. And I think that that's another thing to remember, that when we cast off, there will be times, frankly, when he seems to be sleeping. But there's something we can do about it. We can wake him up by calling on him. And I think that's an incredibly encouraging example there for us as well. So, if, like the disciples, we do cast off, we can learn something more about the Jesus who is God, that we can trust him. We can know he will be with us, and we can know he will respond. I think that is an incredibly encouraging message for us, both as individuals, wherever we are in our lives personally, and as a church at this stage. And we've just sung that wonderful song. It's one I'm very, very familiar with, and I know enjoyed by many people. It's very good at Big Church Day Out, very loud, sung by the writers. But he will bring us safe to shore. That's exactly what he did in this storm. So I just encourage you to have the confidence to cast off, because then you'll see something greater and bigger than you ever imagined. And that's the Lord that we can trust in to bring us safe to shore.